Well, hello. It's a very, very great honor to be with you today. And I'm very sad for the great difficulties that you're facing in your country. And I wish you the greatest success in defending your freedom. I'm going to talk today about some experiments I've been doing in education. And I hope they will be of interest and perhaps useful to you. Um, what is education going to be like in the 21st century? It seems to me that things are changing very, very dramatically with technology. That university education has largely been about imparting information, but the world's information is now becoming available to everyone on the internet. So we don't need to do that anymore. What is it we need to do? University graduates now need to know how to access that information, how to evaluate that information to create knowledge, how to use that knowledge to solve problems, and how to create new information and new knowledge. And it's particularly in the area of creating new knowledge that I would like to talk with you today. Creating information and knowledge is really the area of science. And I wanted to know whether we can enable students to do science. Doing science, I think, should begin in young children, but typically doesn't begin until graduate school. Even most university education about science is about the history of science. Yet students are deciding to avoid or embrace science before the end of high school without actually knowing what it is. Doing science versus learning science is very different. Doing science is about exploring the unknown, while learning science is about the history of what scientists have previously discovered by doing science. Of course, both are necessary, but doing science is neglected. There are challenges to doing science. First, it requires a lot of prior knowledge for most areas. If you were going to study black holes, you'd spend a lot of time studying mathematics before you could begin. It sometimes requires very, very expensive equipment. If you were going to do astronomy to study black holes, for example, it would require a very, very expensive telescope. And thirdly, I'd like to see us be able to do science online. So it's with these three challenges in mind that I've been doing some experiments with students that I want to share with you. Before I begin, I think I need to try to explain what is the unknown that we're going to study. Seems kind of mysterious. We define the unknown by first defining known. Science has a very strict definition of the known. It is measured by our ability to predict the future, sort of like magic. For example, Newton's laws predicted eclipses. That's the known. Yet no one can predict earthquakes, so that's the unknown. So this definition of being able to quantitatively and accurately predict what's going to happen in the future is science's definition of the known. Now, science advances by improving its ability to predict. For example, Einstein's theory of general relativity improved Newton's predictions on the precession of Mercury. And we now accept Einstein's theory over Newton's because it makes more accurate predictions. What is doing science? I think science is a very simple conceptual process having 4 steps. We begin with some phenomenon of interest that's not well understood. We ask a question about it. We try to design an experiment that can answer that question. We get some results by doing the experiment. And usually those results are not what we expected. And the results become the next phenomenon. And so this process of doing science is an iterative phenomenon where we go around this four-step process many, many times before we begin to understand something. The process of going from a phenomenon that we observe to a question about it is the most creative and imaginative part of science. And it's hard. I want students to have that experience of trying to think of an interesting question about a phenomenon and trying to design an experiment that could answer it. What I've come to be interested in as a subject for exploring this kind of doing science is how we make sense of our experience, our cognition. How do we function effectively in such a complicated world with limited sensitive and cognitive resources? For example, our attention is limited to only one item at a time. That's a pretty severe limitation. Our short-term memory is limited to 5 to 7 items for very short periods of time, for example, for about a second. And our high acuity vision is limited to only about 5 degrees of our 180-degree visual field. And we're constantly taking short snapshots of the world we see, and our mind is piecing them together. If we looked at any aspect of mental function, I think we would realize that our capacities are extremely limited, and yet we use them very effectively. And the question I'd like students to think about is how we do that. How do we function effectively with limited resources? The broad answer to that question, not the specific answer, but the broad answer, is that we simplify our experience enough to function effectively, but not too much. And so our research is how we simplify our visual experience. The subjects that we pay attention to are things like objects, faces, spatial relationships, movement, and text or other symbols. And it's likely that our brain devotes special regions to each of these things because brain damage, for example, strokes, can eliminate one's ability to do one of these things while you retain the ability to do the others. So we have sort of special functional attributes devoted to objects, faces, space, motion, and symbols. I try to think of what our visual cognitive functions are that allow us to simplify our experience. And these are thoughts that you will not find in a typical textbook on cognition in the way I've listed them here. But these seem to me ways in which we simplify our experience. The first is contextualization. What is it about? The big picture that I'm involved in right now. For example, you're listening to a lecture. You're not at a party, presumably. Analogy. What do I know about this that is similar to it? Prioritization. What is important and what can I ignore? I suspect we ignore 99% of the information that we're exposed to at any moment. We're constantly filtering that information for what is relevant to our interests. Categorization. What are the properties of the parts, the objects, the things we're seeing? By categorizing things, we don't have to know each one individually. We can think of them as groups of objects like trees or buses. Association. What is known to be relevant? Typically, we find events or other things associated with specific things, and we pay attention to that association. So these five areas of function, I try to relate to these five areas of visual subjects that we pay attention to. Let me just explain a little bit about what I mean here. So contextualization, what is this about? I think we rapidly sense the overall meaning of an image or an event that we're at. What is happening? We practice this skill frequently when watching movies, which may shift quickly from scene to scene. The image on the left is obviously a table setting, while the image on the right is a theater. And if you were at one or the other, your mind would be prepared for a different set of things to happen. Analogy. What do I know that is similar to this? For example, when the DNA structure was discovered in the 1950s, by comparing the DNA molecule to language, led to all sorts of ideas that have fostered research ever since. Ideas about translation, about punctuation, about transcription, about coding, etc. Prioritization, what is important? We are often goal-oriented in search for objects, food, directions, etc. Our vision is tasked with finding what our mind has prioritized, and our attention is constantly scanning, rejecting, and selecting. Categorizations. What properties does it have? We categorize objects and even activities into groups like dogs or cats or running or walking. We use words to designate those categories, symbols. Children have an amazing ability to associate strange new objects like cartoons with their existing categories. For example, it's easy for you to tell that we're depicting a dog on the left and a cat on the right. Any 3-year-old could categorize these images into a dog on the left and a cat on the right, but a computer could not. It'd have to be extensively trained to do that particular job, something that we do naturally to categorize. And yet it's not at all clear what features we use to make these categories. Association. What does this go with? We associate specific items that we like to eat with a particular store or a restaurant. We associate specific words with things or actions when we learn a language. Our ability to associate two things not previously connected in our thinking is, to my mind, the basis of all learning. Look, for example, here's a picture, images of 4 different trucks, but we associate very different things with these trucks. This is an ambulance. This is a fire truck. This is a garbage truck. This is a lunch truck. So the questions then that students can use to drive cognition experiments exploring the topics I've just described are, for example, how well can we do visual tasks? That's performance. Can we improve our performance by practice? That's learning. Does learning one task improve another? That's called transfer. And it's interesting, the transfer is actually very narrow. You have to practice a task that's very closely related to the one that you want to transfer it to. Fourthly, how do we automate our performance? That's called automaticity. This is very, very magical. Imagine, for example, if you can remember learning to ride a bicycle or learning to drive a car. After a while, you no longer pay attention to something that required extremely detailed attention at first. That ability to automate our performance so that we no longer need to pay attention is one of the major ways that we cognitively function effectively. And then there may be another stage of learning called expertise that is of great interest as well. So here's what my students do, is students think of a phenomenon. There are thousands. We do these in vision primarily. They try to ask a question about it. As I say, that's very imaginative and very hard to do, so it's not trivial. And we spend a lot of time thinking about what's an interesting question. They design an experiment to try to answer that question, which usually involves collecting a bunch of images and formulating questions about those images. And then the images and the questions are put into an experimental routine that I'll describe in just a minute. Subjects do the experiment, so students become subjects for other students. And then they get the data back and they analyze the data. So since what we're studying, that is visual cognition, is something that is not understood, cannot be predicted, is part of the unknown, this is a way, I think, to do authentic science. And I think it's applicable to many other subjects of science as well. Here, for example, is one image from a student experiment where he was asking other students to look at an image and tell how many pairs of objects were present. So here's a pair of faces here. Here's a pair of hats here. And if you're given a short period of time, this can be a very challenging task. And you can control the difficulty by the number of objects and by the amount of time that you give the person to solve the problem. Here's another visual task where clocks have been reversed in orientation or turned upside down. And if you're asked to tell the time, you have to rotate the image in your mind. It turns out it actually takes longer if you have to rotate something further. So we are actually going through something analogous to a physical rotation. Here's a challenge where you're asked to guess what should go in this square. And what you see is that there's a lot of symmetry here. And if you wanted to maintain that symmetry, then you would put a line like this in this square. So that's just some examples of the kinds of experiments students can come up with. The way that we do these experiments online is with a very nice program called psychopy.org that was created in England, and a website called pavlovia.org where these experiments can be posted and put online. Typical experiment looks like this, where at the bottom you have various things occurring in order. Some things can be repeated many times. That's what these loops are for. And any one of these routines, if you click on them, you see what's happening in them. There might be some text, there might be an image, there might be a video, there might be a key response. But it's a drag and drop program where you can create experiments without knowing how to code. The PsychoPy is written in Python, and it is then translated into JavaScript automatically when it is transferred to this website, pavlovia.org. PsychoPy is a free program. It's easy to use. It's extremely versatile. For example, a routine, an experiment might consist of presenting text, image, video, audio, asking for a response in any one of those forms, providing feedback if it's a learning experiment on whether people got it right or not, collecting data as to whether the answers were correct and how much time it took. And any of these things can be repeated many times. For example, you can show many different images to be presented. You can ask for many different responses. You can show an image, ask for a response, and repeat that many, many times. And I think this is applicable then, as I say, this approach to many fields of science. And I think we can do a better job of allowing students to do something which is more authentic as an experience of science, to explore things that are not clearly understood, rather than just explore things that are understood. If you want to contact me for more information about this, this is my email, and I'd be happy to respond. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for your lecture. Now we have some questions. The first one is, dear Professor, in your opinion, what is more complex nowadays, doing science or doing engineering, and what is needed more for a sustainable future?
Well, let's start at the end. They're obviously both needed because we are on a technological route, and technology is constantly increasing. We are constantly improving it through science and then developing it through engineering. So science and engineering go hand in hand, and we need both. Engineers often generate the questions that scientists have to solve by coming to limits in what they want to do. So I think they're both important, they're both necessary, and they are both important areas of study, and they are both rewarding areas to spend a career in.
Okay, thank you. The next one from Anna. How do you think is it theoretically possible that we will take control over the chaotic division of cancer cells, thus inviting a cure of aging, for aging?
I think aging is a bigger problem than just cancer. Cancer accounts for something like 1/4 of human deaths. We certainly would like to cure the cancer problem, and we have, I think, not made a great deal of progress despite enormous increases in our information and understanding of cells. We still have a long way to go in curing cancer. Aging is more than cancer. I'm 82 years old. I can tell you about aging. Things slowly deteriorate. I suspect a key element there is that we run out of stem cells for our tissues and stop replacing things. We are continually understanding more about stem cells and how they work and how they differentiate. And maybe someday there will be a cure for aging. I don't know.
Okay, thank you. The next one from Yuri. How did you get an inspiration to work exactly on a cell cycle?
I'm not quite sure. I knew when I completed graduate school, which was in about 1964, that I had worked on gene regulation, and that as a new scientist, I should work on something that was not understood and was important. And as a biologist, it seemed like cell division was a pretty important problem that was not understood. So that's why I decided to work on it.
Thank you, thank you. What do you think in your world so much attention is paid to military development if you can develop science in other areas?
Why is so much attention given to military development?
Yeah.
As sadly, you well know, there come times when we have to defend ourselves. And it's a necessity, it seems, of human life.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor. Thank you for your time and for the great lecture. I hope that we will meet in Kiev in a peaceful place, in a peaceful world. Thank you, and have a good day.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be with you.